Even men at the top of their game find themselves wanting more from life. Whether it's more meaning, unshakable confidence, a bigger impact, more money, deeper love, a hotter sex life, or a powerful legacy. Find out how good your life can be on this episode of Man Alive. Also, did you know there's a skill many men never learn that ends up seriously limiting your professional success and satisfaction in your love and sex life? I put together a free guide to explain this unknown skill and give you exactly what you need to use it today. Get it by heading over to ShaynaJamesCoaching.com or text the word ALIVE, ALIVE, to 44144. That's 44144. You'll also get access to Man Alive outtakes, raw footage, and bonus videos you can only get there. Hello and welcome to this episode of Man Alive. I'm excited to be here today and really deeply moved and touched actually by the topic we're covering today and our guest. So Jed, I have Jed Diamond here today. Jed, welcome.
Thank you.
And I'm probably going to be moved to tears many times during this call if your book is any indication of how this is going to go. But let me give a quick introduction and then we'll dive into the topic we're really going to cover today is about the father wound. So I've done a couple of podcasts on parenting as a father, but we haven't touched yet on, the wounds and the struggles that we face as a result of how our fathers impacted us. So we're going to dive into that. And Jed is the perfect person for this because he's been working as a psychotherapist and written 15 books on, the father wound. The most recent book is My Distant Dad, Healing the Father Wound. But also you've written books on menopause and men in depression and love and lasting relationship. And I mean, really I don't want to say the gamut because it's all focused on, being human and relating to others and ourselves. But you've covered the depths, I would say, of what we go through in our lives psychologically and emotionally.
Well, I've definitely, covered a lot of territory.
Yeah.
And the truth is that the territory I've covered are the issues that I've dealt with in my own life, that I've struggled with, that I've come to feel I needed to understand better, I needed to explore. The 15 books really are a representation of the challenges that I've had and the way in which I've dealt with a lot of my own life, from, as you mentioned, dealing with male menopause when I was going through midlife things, to my first book called Inside Out, Becoming My Own Man, where, in my 40s, I was looking back, trying to make sense of it all. And the most recent book is called, as you mentioned, My Distant Dad, Healing the Family Father Wound, which was, a reflection of a recognition that I think many of us have. For one, I have a father. I had a father. Most of us came into the world with a father somewhere. Mm-hmm. But in the course of my life, there were some challenges, which I'll talk about. But at a certain point, I realized I needed to tell that story first to myself, because there were parts of my life that just didn't quite make sense. And I wanted to understand what happened to my father. I am a father. I have 5 children and 17 grandchildren. So
that's amazing.
The whole idea of fathering became much more present for me. So in many ways, my books reflect kind of what I'm dealing with, what I'm challenged with, what I'm trying to make sense of in my own life. And hopefully as I do that, it resonates with others about things that they're having going on in their own lives.
Yeah. Well, that's what I was going to say, right? I mean, you have so beautifully illustrated the struggles that I think so many face. So, I could go on reading all the thousands of radio programs and TV programs you've been on, but I think for now, let's dive into what would you say the father wound actually is, right? And how would a man know, or a woman who's listening, that they've been impacted by a father who was absent, whether it's just emotionally or, it's clear, right? If someone's dad left, but I think there's so much more than just that physical leaving.
Right. Well, I tell just two little stories that kind of express the issue for me. The first one happened when my son was born. And I was with my wife going through, at that time, the Lamaze childbirth classing and learning how to help her go through the breathing. And it was a long labor, first child. And at a certain point, the doctor said, okay, it's time for your wife to go into the delivery room.
Yeah.
And you need to go now wait in the waiting room. And I knew that was kind of the rules. This is back, almost 50 years ago now.
Yeah.
And that time they didn't have fathers in the delivery room. So I left, kissed my wife, but see you, on the other side. And I was kind of a little glad because I wasn't sure that I might pass out or do something weird and didn't want to interfere. So I'll go wait in the waiting room. But as I was going through the waiting room door, I couldn't go through the door. It was like the door was blocked. And I realized that there was a whispering kind of in my mind of my unborn child saying, I don't want a waiting room father. Your place is with us. And I was like, whoa, that was unexpected. So I just, turned around, walked back and pushed my way into the delivery room. And there was no question of leaving. It was just, I was there and, stood with my wife at the head of the table as she was just getting ready to give birth. And shortly after, our son was born. And as they handed him to me, so I'm just, can still, as anybody that's had children, who you've held when they've been born, you still feel it. It never goes away. And as I was looking down at him, I made a vow that I would be a different kind of father than my father was able to be for me.
Yeah.
And I would do everything I could to bring about a world where fathers were involved with their children from the beginning until the end. So that was the beginning of the father connection with me. And what I was saying to my son about my father was that when I was 5 years old, my father had what's called a nervous breakdown at the time. And he was trying to make a living in Los Angeles and Hollywood at a time when left-leaning writers were blacklisted, and he was part of that era and part of that group, and he couldn't make a living. And when his son, me, was born, and his, that feeling of I now have to support my family.
Yeah, that pressure
just was too much for him. Yeah. And he ended up taking an overdose of pills and ending up in a mental hospital. And I was devastated, and I visited him for a whole year with my uncle at the age of 5.
Yeah.
And I wondered what happened to my father, what had happened to me, and how could I help other people deal with the devastation of that? Well, like most people who've had either an absent father, a distant father that was just present but not emotionally present, or a father who was rejecting, who had different
critical
things.
Father,
critical father, or a father who was just dysfunctional, that was having challenges such that he was just not able to be there. There is a wound that we all have, and the wound can manifest in different ways.
Right, multiple wounds.
It's a wound.
Right.
And often, as was true for me, the wounds get covered over. You feel, all right, they're in the past. Yeah. And then you enter your adulthood and you have your own relationships. And I began to have problems in relationships. I went through 2 marriages that fell apart. And I began to then ask myself, what was wrong? Yeah. What was not right in my life? Yeah. And that was the beginning of starting to see the wounds from my father, the wounds that I had growing up with now a mother who had her own wounds from both the lost father of my father, and then it turned out she had lost her father when she was a little girl.
Wow.
So these are what I call the father wounds, the ways in which having a father that was not there for us in the way that we needed not only wounded us as children, but those wounds touch our hearts and get covered over often and get repressed and hidden, but they start coming out at different times of our lives when we start realizing aspects of our adult relationship, aspects of our love relationships with our wives, with our children, with our mates, with our partners, in some way are influenced by those early unhealed childhood experiences that need to be healed, need to be surfaced if we're going to have the kind of lives that we all want with ourselves, in our love life, in our work life, and in our lives with our own children.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's so much I could say, but I'm just thinking of my own sense of when I got divorced and when I had my son, or now raising a son, I can see these places where the father wounds arise, or where, even starting to have new relationships again and seeing how I relate to men and what I think men think about me before I even know who a person is, right? It's like, oh, some of that comes from these kind of imprints of how my father was with me. And slightly different, I would imagine, or maybe majorly different for men versus women, or for men who are in relationships with women versus men. But what do you see as the common wounds, or how does this father wound show up, right, in men as they start to, whether it's go out and create a career or try to have relationships or be a parent? Are there common themes?
Well, there are two things that I think manifest in most people, and as you say, it's different between people. It's different in some ways between men and women. But what I find common is that there are wounds in how we perceive ourselves. There's almost like there's some parts of us that are missing because we didn't get the blessing of a father, and that impacts us whether we're men or women. So it impacts how we see ourselves, our self-esteem, our self-love, our self-efficacy of being able to be all we can be.
Yeah.
The other part is it manifests in our relationships. So our relationships are, all of them, in a sense, filtered through what we didn't get from our father. So for some, it manifests in a hunger for, a certain kind of man. It also, if you're in a woman looking for a man, or in a homosexual relationship, or the feeling that I have to find some part of me that's missing, or I'm never satisfied with the partner that I have because they never seem to measure up.
Right.
That was true of my mother, who lost her father when she was 5 years old. And she had multiple men in her life, including my father. And those men could never live up to the shadow. And I ended up, before I met my present wife, I said I had 2 failed marriages. Both of the women that I married were women who had lost their fathers in some way when they were young. My first wife, her father died when she was about 7 years old, and she grew up without a father. My second wife, her father didn't die, but when she got into adolescence and became kind of a young woman sexual being, he rejected her. He couldn't relate to her as a sexual being. So whatever it is, we have these wounds that either manifest as a certain level of anger outwards towards the world, to others, or an inner anger and a depression that comes out as, not feeling good about us. And so, anger seems to be either suppressed anger, rage that's acted out, or anger that's turned within.
Inward.
Seems to be a common experience that many, certainly men that I work with, have, and many women as well.
I also remember in your book where you wrote about wanting to cry, right? And that you often did, but only when you were alone.
Right.
And that seems to be a common theme of the men I've worked with over the years of it's not okay to have these feelings, to have this, these emotions. And if I have them, I either have to stuff them and pretend like I don't have them, or I have to do this alone.
Right. Yeah. For me, it was, with a father who, in some way was absent and had, broken down. I had a feeling, number one, that I had to be the perfect man.
Yeah.
I had to be the breadwinner in a way that my father wasn't.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember, this is another little scene that I remember when I was like 4 years old before my father left, and I was in the kitchen of our home, and my mother was there with a number of her neighbor women friends, and they were all talking about their men in their lives, their husbands, in a way that I didn't even understand exactly what they were saying, but they were critical.
Yeah.
My husband, never could live up to my sexual needs, or one woman saying. Another one was, he was always home. He's underfoot. He's never out in the world. It's like I have a third child at home. And what I remembered was this mixture of disdain and pity, and just a feeling of inadequacy about the men in their lives. And how that translated to me as a child was, I made a vow as a 4-year-old that I would never let women talk about me like that.
Right. You would do everything, whatever
I would die before I would. And what that translated was, I will never be out of work. I will always have a job, which just about killed me, working in jobs that, and when I finally lost a job, it was like I felt so terrified.
Yes.
And I think a lot of men have that feeling of, I've got to, the man box, I call it, that prescribes who we can be and what we must be.
And without often that,
the requirements of that are so onerous that in order to do that, something dies in us, or something breaks down in us.
Yes.
And I think there are many of us live with these things. And as you say, we don't have anybody we can talk to about them.
Yeah.
We often keep those tears, those anger, the feelings inside, because there feels like there's so much, if I ever let it out, that's how I felt, I would just destroy anybody that was on the other side of that.
Right.
Or I would cry and I'd never stop.
Yeah.
Or I'd want to break down and crawl into somebody's arms and I'd never want to leave.
Yeah.
So there was so much fear of these feelings that I think was certainly true for me. And I think so many other men, often feel this, and hunger for somebody to talk to unburden with, to have, a caring person that can listen without judgment. I think we all, are looking for that.
Right. And kind of like you said, there's such an identification in that man box with, this is what I produce, and this is what I accomplish, and this is what I provide.
Yeah.
That, men come to me saying, right, if that goes away and they don't know who they are necessarily. And, I love that you said, for me, it's the same language of, men. I see men dying inside, even men who on the surface are successful and they're in partnerships and they have children, and you wouldn't know it. I mean, that's the kind of the isolation and the pain, or that mask that covers the pain, is just, it seems to be killing men, whether it goes all the way to a man who would even consider committing suicide or attempting suicide, or men who kind of live out the rest of their days settling or feeling like, there's something so dark in me, I can't let anyone see it, or these tears will never stop if I start, so I have to just keep going, moving, doing to not feel that.
Exactly. And for me, there were two sides of this I mentioned for me, and I think in a lot of men. One is anger that gets suppressed and pushed down, that comes out. It came out in my relationships. I was a very angry man that I didn't understand why. And it seemed like, it was justified. I mean, who wouldn't be angry if your wife's treating you this way? And I realized so much of that anger, I mean, there was some real anger. My wife did things that upset me,
Mm-hmm.
but I realized it was really out of the control of the situation. I didn't get where it was coming from, but I realized at times it was just kind of overblown and there was too much of it for what the situation might call for. But I didn't know how to deal with it. I didn't know how
Yeah.
to understand it. So I would explode and then I'd feel guilty, and I'd
Uh-huh.
explode and I'd feel guilty. And the other side of that is we start feeling depressed. We start feeling, that I call it depressive anger that so many men have, that
Yeah.
often women express depression by feeling sad. And I've come to see that men often experience depression by being irritable and angry.
Yes.
I wrote a book called The Irritable Male Syndrome that
Yeah.
talked about that. And that's how it was for me. And so, as you say, that turning that feeling in and not being able to express it
Yeah.
often manifests as depression. And we know that it's not common, but the suicide rate for men compared to women is 3 to 18 times higher
Yeah.
for the same age. So we
Right.
know young men in their 20s have like a 3 or 4 times higher suicide rate than women in
Mm-hmm.
their 20s.
Mm-hmm.
But as men get in, this is interesting, in retirement age, in their
Yeah.
60s, the suicide rate for males goes up to 6 times
Wow.
higher than women of the same age. And
Yeah.
when you get into our 80s, which, many of us live that, the suicide rate for men is 18 times
Oh.
higher than it is for women. So
Wow.
even quote, successful men all of a sudden have this giving up, this
Yeah.
feeling of, I'm not worth anything. I don't deserve to be here. People would be better off without me.
Mm.
And people don't even know that this is going on. I mean,
Mhm.
we understand, generally that men commit suicide at higher rates, but nobody until these recent studies have really gotten, one, how deep the wounds are,
Mhm.
how little we talk about it,
Mhm.
and how this anger and rage is the flip side of depression that,
Right.
if not treated, can lead to suicide. And I think that's where a lot of my work has been in recent years, is
Yeah.
really tuning in to the emotional needs of men so that we
Yes.
can give them a voice to speak all of the feelings, their
Yeah.
anger, their hurt, their fear, their sadness, all of
Yeah.
that we need a place where those truths can be expressed.
Yeah. It's so important. And um I'm so grateful that you've done the work to realize, right, that depression for men looks different, looks like irritability and anger often, because I'm thinking about a man in my life who I watch him in his relationship with his wife, and I can see the irritability and the anger and the frustration. And I wouldn't have actually thought, oh, he might be depressed,
Right.
but now as you're framing it that way, I'm like, oh, right. And it's not only men who are on the verge of suicide, right, that you and I are
Right.
talking about. It's like there's a whole range of men also who walk around in the world feeling overwhelmed by life,
Right.
and who don't want to be seen in those critical ways by women. And then I also believe that we need to educate women on how to handle. I'm curious what you would say about this, right? Because I think women can be terrified of the depth of their feeling and their emotions and the
Right.
sense of being out of control, because it's not common. We're not raised to see that. And so then I think there can be an experience of, oh my God, if he does feel all of this and I just hold space for this, is he ever going to come back? Right.
Right. Right.
So
Yeah.
I think on both sides, we need some help.
Yeah, and I think your point is really well taken. I can't tell you how many times in my own personal life women have said, "Well, tell me how you feel.
Mm-hmm.
Tell me what's going on inside. You don't talk to me. You don't open up to
Uh-huh.
me." And my experience was, number one, it was hard. It's hard for me to open up.
Mm-hmm.
Men often don't have the language. We're trained sometimes to be able to be angry, but not so much to talk about hurts and
Yeah.
fears and worries and shame and guilt and, the more negative feelings. But there's also the experience I've had that when I would open up with my feelings, and often they were, really deeply felt and often overwhelming, it would scare women. Particularly angry feelings are very fearful for a lot of women. And so they'd say, "Tell me how you feel," and I go, "Ah," and they go, "Ah, I didn't mean that. I meant, tell me how much you love me and how kind I am." And well, yes, I can do that, but there's other feelings that many men have. And I know for me, one of the important ways in which I was able to do that was in a men's group.
I was just going to ask about that. Yeah. That's perfect.
So I've been in a men's group. My wife posits it this way. My wife and I have been, lovingly married for 39 years. Mm-hmm. And Carlin says that the core reason that she believes we've been able to have such a good 39-year marriage is that I've been in a men's group that's been meeting for 40 years. And that's true. Our men's group, we're going to actually be meeting again. We used to meet every week when we lived in Marin County in San Rafael, and we've moved over the years. So now we meet 4 times a year for 5 days at a time. One of our guys is up in Washington, and we're all spread out. So we still meet, and we've been meeting for 40 years. And
that's
we've gone
incredible.
Through, births of our children, divorces, health issues. Yeah. But the key is that we've created a safe place where we can talk to each other. Mm-hmm. And I think there are certain things that we can and need to talk to women about, our mm-hmm. partners and women friends. And there's also places where we need to just be with the same sex group. And men need men's groups. And I work to help people connect in men's groups. And I teach, how to do that. And I help support men, and I have classes and so on. Yeah. So this really, however we do that, guys, if there's anything I would say to the men that are out there listening, that if you resonate with any of this, that part of how we find the ability to be vulnerable, to talk about what's really in our hearts, what's really going through us, is to find, a men's group, to, start a men's group, to be in a men's group. Yeah. I remember being with Robert Bly, who's a poet who I've, been in touch with. Many know his work and his poetry. That's and his work with men's groups. And one of the things that Robert said that I thought was really, really important, and he said it poetically as he does, he said that young men, he was speaking, but true of all men, I'm sure. He says, young men need to be in the presence of older men in order to hear the sound that male cells sing. And I thought that was so wonderful, that male cells, which every cell in my body is male. Yeah. This is every cell in your body is female. And in order for me to be who I am, I need to be in the company of other men, because all my male cells, all my energies resonate to a male frequency that needs to be echoed back and held understood and has our own symphony of maleness that's unique and good and wonderful. And it helps us, I think, and certainly has me over these last 40 years, to really come to understand who I am as a being, who I am as a male. And, as I say, my wife really attributes that success to my being able to be in a men's group. She's incidentally in a women's group that she's been in for many years. Yeah. But I really hold that as a possibility and an encouragement for men who really understand the need to be with people who they can express their deepest truths to.
Well, and that's what I love too, is that you're guiding men to create men's circles, right? Where it's not just getting together with the guys and having a beer. Right. It's actually expressing your, concerns and challenges and deepest fears, and holding each other as good and great, even in the midst of, no matter what comes out of you, or no matter how hopeless you're feeling, or any of that. So that's incredible.
Yeah, and that's needed. And same thing with anger. I mean, we've been able to express our anger towards each other and about, feelings and be able, I'm actually teaching a class on anger, of how to live with an angry male, which
Yeah.
is me in many ways that I teach online. It's for men and women. But I think so many of us, don't know how to either handle our own anger as men,
Yeah.
and many women don't know how to handle or understand male anger. It
Man's
either
anger.
scares them and they just want to close down or get away. That was true of my
Mhm.
wife. My anger just frightened her, and I didn't think I was that angry. I mean, I was just talking my feelings,
Right.
and I'm not angry. What do you mean I'm angry? And it just didn't occur to me how frightening my deep voice is, how just my energy can be frightening. So I'm helping men be able to understand, express their anger, and how women can both help themselves hear anger in different ways, to be
Yeah.
able to set good, safe boundaries for themselves, and how to help men who often, are depressed or are angry in ways that are hurtful to them and their families, but are resistant to talking about it, getting
Yes.
help for it, and how women can be there for men who may not be able to, express their needs directly. And
So
so
great.
it's some
Right. Because I could
some gifts that
see.
we can hopefully
Yeah.
share and get and give to each other in these classes.
Yeah, that's really powerful. And I can see where, right, some men, it's clear and obvious, right, who might do what you did, where it was like you would come forward and that intensity. And then other men I could see would just pull back and
Right.
be hidden and,
Yeah.
unavailable,
Right.
and how both of those I think could be scary for a
Right.
partner.
Right.
And I'm grateful that you're helping people deal with that, right? And
Yeah.
understand
I guess one of the big needs in our society. I mean, if you look out at the world, certainly one of the issues is, this anger and rage
it.
that comes out
Mhm.
in violence and shootings, and in the rhetoric, in the conflicts that are going on.
Yep.
And I think some of that is we all carry in our hearts and in our psyches, and
Yeah.
and just a very simple understanding is that if men are very angry, there's a reason for that. It's
Yeah.
not just because we're bad guys. It's because there's a huge amount of pain and suffering that hasn't found a way to be expressed in a constructive way. And so
Yeah.
it comes out in all of these destructive ways. And that can be, not only hurtful to the man, his families, communities. Uh, and we need to find ways, and there are ways. And that's part of what I try to do through my books, through my website, through my classes, through my men's groups and so on, to
Yeah.
really find these ways that we can come together and really speak our deepest needs and our deepest truth, and be able to heal ourselves as we help heal each other.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. And I again, just that recognition, right, of the pain and suffering that is going on under the surface of the anger that's being expressed, or the abuses of power, even, even with the Me
Yeah.
Too movement. I often think about, okay, right, as a collective, I've talked about this with someone else, as a collective, men are seen as powerful, and yet individual men don't always feel powerful to get their needs or desires met.
Right.
And so, yeah, I'm curious in a way. It sounds like being in the men's group was a big part of what had you feel more capable or powerful to not only accomplish what you wanted in the world, but also to maybe to be able to receive, right? And to have things come back to you, to take things in, to be nourished, to be nurtured,
Mm-hmm.
right? What are some of the other things that you would recommend, or that you've put into place in your life
Yeah.
that support you?
Well, as you know, I wrote among the 15 books that I wrote, I wrote one called The Warrior's Journey
Yeah.
Home,
Yeah.
Healing Men, Healing the Planet. And what I came to realize is that there is an inherent warrior spirit in
Mm-hmm.
men,
Mm-hmm.
that's a different spirit than what we think of as the violent male, or
Yeah.
the killer man, or the soldier that goes out and kills. And I mentioned in the book that there is a term in Tibetan that means warrior. And warriorship means in that tradition is the spirit of human bravery.
That's
You know,
beautiful.
not killing or power over, but being brave enough to be who you are.
Mm.
And I say that there's three questions that we all want answered by the time we finish our life journey.
Mm.
You know, and the first is, did I live? Did I live my life, an authentic life? Basically, did I really actualize and become all that I could be?
Right.
That's
Rather
the
than the
first question.
expectations and the shoulds and
Right, the
the things that
shoulds
other
and
people
trying to
wanted.
live up to somebody else. You know, there in Jewish tradition, there's a little story about the Rabbi Zushio, who's a very famous rabbi and wise man, and supposedly when he died, he went before God, and you know, and God says to him. You are always trying to be a great rabbi. You're trying to be the next Moses or the next, you know, great. And he said, what I really wanted you was to be Susha, not Moses. And I think so many of us think that we have to be great by somebody else's standards. So
Yes.
first question we have to answer is, did I live an authentic life? Second question is, did I love? You know, was I able to deeply love others, which also involves loving ourselves?
Yeah.
And the third question is, did I make a difference in the world? You know, did I live out my calling? And I think part of, you know, just in simple form, the work that I've been doing is to help men through the various ways that I've worked with men and through, you know, Men Alive, which is my, you know, my website, and the work that I do is through Men Alive, really captures that idea to be alive in these three ways and to help men to live an authentic life, to love deeply and well, and to make a difference in the world. And that's kind of what I'm still working on in my own life. That's what I tried to express in you know, my new book, you know, with healing the father wound as part of, I think, really coming to ourselves, really owning who we are, healing the old wounds, and, you know, allowing the true self of our spirit to emerge in the world and to express itself.
Yeah. Yeah. I was just having the thought as you were saying that, and I love those questions, live, you know, living, loving, and creating a difference or making a difference in the world.
Right.
And I was just thinking about how a lot of those questions, I would think, you know, as time is moving on, I think the younger generations are getting wiser and wiser. And so they're asking these questions earlier. But I think for a lot of men who are listening to this, these questions start, you know, in midlife in a way, or after the first third at least, right? Where it's like, you know, and this typical idea of a midlife crisis, where everything, you know, you start to question, and then everything starts to fall apart. But I think, and I'm curious your opinion on this, that it doesn't have to be a crisis if we start asking these questions, if we have the support that you talked about in place.
Right.
Then it becomes more like an opportunity to go deeper and to actually start to reflect on these things.
Well, I think there are two parts of it. I think there's a reason why we tend to wait until midlife in order to be confronted with these questions or to ask these questions. And part of it is that you have to have a certain amount of life experience to do that. And I say when we're in our 20s, we're getting out in the world, and we're either doing what our parents wanted us to do and society wanted us to do, or we're rebelling against what our parents and society wanted us to do. And then we hit, you know, somewhere 28 to 33, we go through a transition time. And I say between 33 and 37, we're really putting down roots. We're really trying to find out, you know, where am I? What's my thing? Yeah. And I say when we're somewhere around 37, 38 is the first time, interestingly, in my, you know, model, that we really can become our own man. We really can, you know, like I said in my first book, Inside Out, Becoming Your Own Man, was that notion. 37 is the beginning. And then we go through this transition, usually in our mid 40s and between 40 and 50, that I talk about as the midlife, change. Some call it a crisis.
Like
Hormones are
change.
changing,
Yeah.
psyche's changing, and we're basically at a place where we've lived, somewhere around half our lives, and then we begin asking in a way that we really can't earlier on when we're busy making a life, busy sometimes making families, having children, and so
Yeah.
on.
Yeah.
So, in our 40s, we take a breath, and I tell people, when you hit 40, there's only two directions you're going to go. If you neglect that question of who am I and where am I going, you start to go downhill. You start to have the unexamined life starts catching up with you,
Yes.
or it becomes a rebirth, a second mountain that we're here to climb. I call it super adulthood. We've gone through first adulthood, and this next half of life can be, the best time, the most productive time. I'll be 75 this year, and I just feel like this period of life can be, full of love, full of excitement, full of passion, but it starts in the willingness to deal with some of these, these deeply felt, deeply experienced, emotionally charged issues of healing the past, healing the present, and making a decision about the future that we really want for ourselves as we move ahead.
Yeah. Yeah. Amazing. What would you say to a man, this question's coming up for me, who, there is that sense of, maybe, oh shit, or maybe, wow, either I've gotten a glimpse of some of these issues that are starting to arise, or I haven't touched into those yet. And that sounds kind of terrifying. Or, right, I am afraid if I start to feel these things, are they ever going to stop? Am I ever going to get to a place where, I feel good again, where I'm not struggling? What would you say to that?
Well, what I'd say is, we call it in some ways the dark night of the soul, or that feeling of going through hell that we all experience at some points in our lives, many, many times for some of us. And there's an old saying, when you're going through hell, don't stop.
Don't stop, right? Keep going.
Keep going.
Yeah.
Because there really is light at the end of the tunnel. And I think the key is not only don't stop, but don't go through it alone. And that, if there's kind of one, kind of bit of wisdom that I would share with men that are listening, is, don't go through it alone. Reach out. I think the cause of the anger, the depression, the sadness that males experience at so many points in their lives is because we're basically lonely.
Yeah.
We don't feel connected on an emotional level. We may have, quote, lots of acquaintances. We may be successful in our work. We may be at the top of our game. But on some very deep level, we don't feel emotionally connected. And that can start with reaching out to one other person. It can start in joining a men's group. It can even start in just, going out with your buddies for, a bottle of beer after work. So, I mean, all of these ways, we've evolved in our men's group from a, more superficial, just, hey, let's get together and talk about life, to now we talk about some of the deepest parts of our lives. What's it like?
You did start, though, just getting together to...
Oh, yeah. I mean, when we first began, it started with a workshop with a guy named Herb Goldberg, who was a psychologist who wrote a book in the 70s called The Hazards of Being Male. And he talked about, that men have paid a heavy price, he mentioned it, for our masculine privilege, that, as a group, men have achieved a whole level of privilege that hasn't been open to women and, minority men, and, white men have done pretty well, but we paid a price for the privilege. And part of that is being cut off, feeling depressed, being angry, suffering heart attacks and earlier deaths. So I think part of that early men experience was one, hey, let's just realize that we all have challenges. And from there, we've moved into, like I say, really deep places over the
Yeah.
years where we've really, hung out there with each other through the difficult times and through the divorces and the anger and the pain and the suffering and the losses and the
Yeah.
divorces and the medical problems. And one man died in the group, our
Yeah.
elder, and we all expect someday it's going to be us. And one guy we're dealing with in the group who's got some cognitive decline, and he's really struggling to deal with mental challenges.
Yeah.
So the really key is don't do this alone.
Yeah.
Obviously, the fact that you're watching this and listening to this is saying you're one of the guys that is reaching out.
Yeah.
And so, in answer to your question, the questioning, the suffering in a way, the hurt, the heartache is a way of saying, I want more. I want to connect more deeply.
Yeah.
And I'll just say to all the people that are seeing this now, I'd like to connect with you too. I don't know you each personally, but I would like to. And part of my work is, and part of why I'm doing this webinar is because I really see part of my calling at this time of life is to reach out to younger men in particular, and that means anybody under 75. And older men, if you're over 75, I'd like to connect with you too.
Yeah.
But we need to be there for each other.
Yeah.
We need to be able to see the good in each other, to realize we're going through challenging times. The environment is telling us in many ways that we're living in ways on the planet that isn't sustainable.
Yeah.
I think part of the anger and the rage that's going on is because on some deep level, men recognize that we are living in a way cut off from the earth, that we're doing, things to the planet as though it were our private way that we can do whatever we want.
Yeah.
And what I believe is the way we treat the earth is the way we treat ourselves. So if we're being harmful to the earth, we're probably being harmful to ourselves. Mm-hmm. And how we treat ourselves is then how we treat other men, other people, and how we treat other women. So the healing that needs to happen is full circle. We heal ourselves and we heal the earth and we heal each other as we recognize that the problem is disconnection and the solution is reconnection.
Yeah. And I thank you for being so vulnerable, because I think that is one of the things that, if you are a man who's watching, listening to this, you recognize that you're not alone, or you're at least starting to recognize. And I think what you've done is, put your insides out there so that other men can see and realize that they're not alone. And so, to keep reaching out instead of that sense of there must be something wrong with me if I'm suffering or struggling with this, to actually realize everybody's suffering and struggling with something, and that you can put yourself out there and reach out to another man without having to feel like it makes you lesser or weaker or any of those judgments.
Exactly.
So thank you for being a leader in that and championing that.
Well, thank you. And, I just want to, say this to everybody that's listening. One of the offerings that I want to give to anybody that's watching this and would like to take me up on it is on my website, menalive.com. I put up a graphic that you'll see if you go there that tells people about the new book that I've written, My Distant Dad.
Which I highly recommend.
Thank you. I know you've had a chance to look at it, and giving a free chapter, the first chapter that's called, Mad Father, Dutiful Son, which kind of captures kind of where my father and my relationship started. Yeah. And so we're giving a free chapter to anybody that feels they resonate with this and would like to come and take advantage of that. It's there and available, and we're happy to let people get an introduction to this 70-year journey that I've been on, that I express in the book, and love to have you come share it with me.
Yeah. Again, I highly recommend it. It's profound. I read the whole book, in the past week, and simultaneously I laughed and I sobbed, and it was just, it it touched me so deeply to be able to look at my own struggles, to look at my ex-husband's struggles, to look at my son, to recognize, some of what my dad was going through or still is going through. So yeah, really, really profound.
Yeah, the problem with the book was the editor. I had a male editor, and he, editing's really important. He was working really hard to edit, and he says, God, it's taken me a lot longer than I expected because it touches me so deeply.
Yes.
I'm crying, halfway through the first chapter, and so I'm hanging in there. It's great. I'm glad to feel with you, but it's taking me longer
hard
than
to edit.
I expected. So
yeah.
A lot of the people that read the book, including men who've known me for years, close friends, said, God, I never knew this side of you.
Right.
Because, a lot of this stuff doesn't come up in the course of your normal interactions with people. And so it's really a very, personal and somewhat, passionate, raw slice of what I think was certainly true in my life and what many, I think, other men particularly experience, because I think all of us, to one degree or another, grow up with some wounding in our father line, whether it was our father, our brother, or uncles. Somewhere in the line, we lost something significant. Yeah. And it's time that we grieved our losses and found in my case, the journey to finding my lost father. You'll find, as you know, there's a really powerful and happy ending to my story and many others who go through even after you feel like, this is hopeless. Often there's hope beyond the hopeless time and healing beyond the wounds.
Well, and I think that's a great place to complete this, right? That hopelessness doesn't have to be the end. Right. And that I found hope through your story, and you've found hope in these places that you didn't think would necessarily be there, and through all the trials and tribulations, that there actually is hope and there is a light at the end of the tunnel. And it can be through entering into some of those darkest places, and getting the support to go through it. Actually, we find ourselves on the other side. So thank you so much for doing this work for all of these decades, and for, again, being willing to put your own vulnerabilities out there and support men and women through this. I'm so glad you joined us for today's episode of Man Alive. I hope it gives you a sense of what's possible and how good your life can be. If you like what you heard, I'd be so grateful for you to subscribe to Man Alive and write a quick review that helps men like you find us. And again, head over to ShanaJamesCoaching.com/manalive to get outtakes, videos, and raw footage I only share there. These are some of the most interesting parts of these expert conversations. You can also grab your copy of The Unknown Power to accelerate your career and solidify your confidence with women, because the two are related, and I know you don't have to settle for one or the other. Join us each week for a new episode of Man Alive.